title I was given was How Do Journals Publish Research, to which I added the rather cheeky subtitle, What Has Changed in the Last 300 Years? And the short answer is not a lot. So if Doug wants to speed things up, I'm afraid you've got to look for a rather long timescale on this. What's my evidence for that? So I did go back exactly 300 years. You're probably familiar with the philosophical transactions of the Royal Society of the United Kingdom, which were actually started in the 1660s. But if we look in 1712, exactly 300 years ago, very nice paper. I mean, mainly my day job is running training courses, telling people how to write papers, and I explain to them you need a good question and an introduction to make it interesting, then you describe your methods and you have a good conclusion, and this is perfect. It's also nice, as this is a sort of Anglo-German cooperation, to see that this is a paper that was looking at the chalybeer, or spa waters called by the Germans acid or Sauerbrunnens or fountains, but proved to be of contrary nature, that is, alkalis. And very interesting, so the author had heard that these were referred to as acidic, but actually had a suspicion that they were alkali. So he had a nice research question, a nice reason for doing the research. He describes his methods and results. There are various ones, including tasting the waters and so on, but this was, one here, which I think we would recognize as a test. And then a very nice, clear, actually clinical conclusion. Let this be a caution to those that design to make these waters pass better by urine, that they do not make use of any acids, it being a common practice to use, and so on. So he actually has a clinical conclusion, and this is in 1712. So the IMRAD structure was alive and kicking, and print technology was, the latest thing, and this is what we were doing. Is the style of journals evidence-based? Doug mentioned the very important point of different users, and I think that's something that we certainly ignore. I think, again, like training, we have a tendency to ask people what they like rather than actually test what they find useful. And that is a very different thing. There is very little research on the usefulness of printed clinical research. And the house styles that journals impose, I have to say, are usually based on nothing more than the editor's feelings about a particular typeface, a column width, the way the page looks. And there is a little evidence about readability, but I've never yet seen a journal that says this is an evidence-based house style that we're going to impose on your article, because it actually makes it clearer for readers. So let's take a step back and think a little bit beyond just the IMRAD, the basic clinical paper. What else are journals doing? So you might think of various functions of a journal. They register the research. By this I don't mean, I'm not thinking about trial registration, but particularly simply as a record of who did it. So, they link the author's name and so on, and we can then measure with metrics. They distribute and disseminate the research findings, and that's certainly something that has perhaps changed a little. Doug mentioned already they archive and form a permanent store, and they have some level of quality checking, be it the peer review or the technical editing or the imposing of reporting guidelines. And then there are some perhaps peripheral functions that journals also do, like entertain us, which we're perhaps less concerned about today. So we've got these basic functions of a journal. Is that a new idea of thinking about journals? No, it's not. Back to the Anglo-German link, we have Henry Oldenburg, native of Germany, but who became the first secretary of the Royal Society in London. And he was writing to Robert Boyle during the 1660s, just as they were establishing the journal, the Philosophical Transactions, and he mentions registration. So he says, we must be careful of registering as well the person and time of any new matter, whereby the honour of the invention will be inviolably preserved to all posterity. He mentioned dissemination by saying that by having a journal, all ingenious men will be thereby encouraged to impart their knowledge and discoveries. He He talked about archiving. He said, I should not neglect the opportunity of having some of my memoirs preserved by being incorporated into a collection that is like to be as lasting as useful. And he referred to a quality control. He said that articles should only be published after they've been first reviewed by some members of the society. So these 4 functions of the journal, Oldenburg was clear about in the 1660s. We haven't really changed much at all. Okay, there are a few things that have changed. I will agree that the distribution and dissemination has changed, perhaps in the last 10 years more than ever. So we've got electronic journals, and that does allow, for example, changes in the way we find information. Interestingly, though, that perhaps reduces the function of the journal because people no longer search journals, they search for individual articles. They're less aware, actually, perhaps, of where something is published, but they're searching for keywords, they're searching using search engines and bibliographic databases. There are different business models which have allowed things such as pay-per-view for an individual article, and possibilities such as open access publishing, which was simply not possible with the big capital costs of setting up print and distribution and so on. It's allowed faster communication with reviewers, but it hasn't greatly speeded up the peer review process because the reviewers are still busy and still take a long time to respond. And it's allowed us to produce some clever metrics, such as the article level metrics as well as journal level metrics. So, there have been some changes. There have been 1 or 2 definite improvements, and I have to say I'm sort of not being a paid advocate here for the people who run Crossref. It just happens that all the things I could think of were things that they had done, but they really have captured. So this is a very interesting not-for-profit initiative, collaboration between publishers that has allowed us to really harness the technology to link references, for example, through the DOIs, the digital object identifiers, to detect plagiarism and redundant publication using the text matching software on Crosscheck. And to their latest thing is really a version control system to mark the publisher-curated version of a document, which will allow retractions, corrections, and so on to be flagged up very quickly, and this is through Crossmark. So there have been developments. We have used the technology to a certain extent, but we're still basing it on that 2,500, 3,000 word paper that looks very similar to the one that was published in the 17th century. So I mentioned that a lot of the things that we do about journals are not evidence-based, but just at the risk of reiterating what Doug has said, just to run through a little bit about what is evident, what evidence is there about what does work. There is certainly absolutely incontrovertible, huge amounts of evidence that following reporting guidelines improves the quality of reporting medical research. And this is a systematic review, it should say 2006, it wasn't 206, but this was one of many, as Doug says, showing that adoption of guidelines such as Consort was associated with improved reporting. Something that I feel is often neglected when we look at journal processes is technical editing. We talk a lot about peer review, and we think about the use of expert and invited reviewers. We don't so often look at the role of the technical editors, who are perhaps just imposing the house style, but there is some evidence that they're also very good at spotting inconsistencies, columns that add up to 102%, problems, and actually some sort of substantive issues. And I was involved in a Cochrane review showing that actually there's almost more evidence that technical editing improves research reports than that peer review does. So we know that it improves readability, it can identify mistakes and therefore increase accuracy, and reduce ambiguity, make the papers clearer to read. So we know that the guidelines work, but both enforcing guidelines and investing in technical editing is costly. It does cost money. And publishers seem reluctant, understandably, to invest in anything more than they have to. And I think particularly there is an interesting challenge that electronic publishing has lowered the distribution costs. Of course, it hasn't lowered the costs of things like technical editing. You still require people to do that. And some of the sort of high-volume models, if you like, of publishing now are relying on cutting costs, such as technical editing, and many of the online journals actually invest less in that than the print journals did. Now, if it's just a case of making sure that the spelling is consistent between the US or the American convention, UK or American convention, that probably doesn't matter. But if we're missing out on technical editing that could spot errors, then I think perhaps that is a problem. Increasingly, journals are expecting authors to follow guidelines. But we know that people don't read guidelines. Doug's example of the Amazon one is a great one. Roy Pitkin, a former editor of the American Journal of Obstetrics and Gynecology, did this nice study. It was actually looking at peer reviewers rather than authors, but he inserted in the middle of his instructions a little line that says, if you've read this and call our office, we'll send you a gift. It was in fact a phone card worth $20. And he showed that less than 20% of his peer reviewers actually claimed that gift. And that's actually published in the New England Journal. So we have evidence that people do not read guidelines. So I conclude that journals are happier to endorse the guidelines, and Sally Hopewell and others have shown that, over 80% of the journals recommended that the authors should follow it, but they're less happy to invest resources in actually enforcing the guidelines. It doesn't cost to endorse them, it does cost to enforce them. And here's yet another recent study looking at looking at vaccines trials, looking at adherence with consort. Only 20% stated in the title that the trial was randomized, 37% indicated what the primary outcome was, and only 13% reported a method of allocation concealment. Again, great deficiency in the reporting. And these were in the, particularly in sort of high impact journals, I think, as well. So, worrying. It's a similar pattern, I have to say, for trial registration. Again, we know that it's not a panacea, but it is an important step in improving transparency, making sure that primary outcomes don't disappear or don't shift from the protocol to the publication, having a record so that we know a trial has been done. And similarly, journals are increasingly endorsing trial registration, but they're not actually enforcing it. So again, a couple of studies, one from Germany, one from Croatia, one looking at urology journals, and found that despite the fact that these journals said trial registration was mandatory, it was a condition to publish, only 71% of the papers actually had been registered properly. And the paper by Huich et al., where, again, they found that actually nearly 80% had registered, but not prospectively. So they had registered after the study had begun. And if you looked at the registration, in nearly 40% of them, details of the primary outcome were missing from the trial register. So one of the main functions of registration had been been fulfilled. So this again is in journals that say they require registration, but they're clearly not checking it. What about peer review? It again is essentially unchanged for 300 years or so. There have been some experiments. So the Medical Journal of Australia tried with public peer review, putting something on a website as soon as it was submitted, inviting comments. They found, I think it was a median of only 2 comments per paper. Many papers received no comments, and the quality of comments was not as good as inviting peer reviews. Similarly, Nature tried a bold experiment and said, would you like your paper to be posted on our website and we can invite comments? Understandably, though, I think authors were reluctant because, of course, that would have then prevented them from publishing it elsewhere. And so actually very few authors agreed to that. So again, the experiment failed. We hear increasingly that reviewers are difficult to find, and that has not changed, I think, in the last 300 years. In fact, maybe the problem has got worse. So I don't think peer review has fundamentally changed. Electronic communication does allow us to do some different things, and there have been some developments in post-publication review, commentary and annotation. But my observation is that this has failed to replace traditional peer review. The quality of the comments, the breadth of coverage, the sort of in-depth approach of a peer review is not replaced by post-publication commentary. And I actually summarised this in a blog I wrote for the BMJ, which I entitled, "If Talk is Cheap, Why is Peer Review So Expensive?" You know, we have blogs, we have social media, the journals, and I think it's good that they are encouraging rapid response, they're encouraging annotation, but we don't actually see the level of commentary that we get for the pre-publication peer review. So although there have been some developments in things like Web 2.0 and various, as I say, uses of the technology, we haven't really moved on. We also know that post-publication review and commentary is not a panacea. So Peter Gertcher looked at the rapid responses to articles that had appeared in the BMJ and looked to see how often the authors actually addressed those comments, because obviously there's only point in writing a response if the authors then respond to that. And they found that just under half of the authors actually responded to substantive criticism. So this was not just adding additional data or saying this is a nice paper. This was a substantive criticism that really needed a response, something to do with the methods or the analysis that required a response, and the authors didn't respond. So although we have this facility, we're not actually using it. I also think that the system of producing, a 3,000-word paper document is extraordinarily wasteful. And I'm involved with various other people I know in this room. We're looking at a series on waste, and I've actually taken this figure from one of these papers. But it was sort of an idea that I've had for a long time based on my experience working with drug companies, where you will develop a very nice long protocol, often 100 pages long. There will be then details of that will be extracted and put on the study register. There will be further materials like investigators' brochures, patient information leaflets and so on, which again are derived from the protocol, but not directly. They usually start with a fresh piece of paper. From the analysis, then we generate the data, and from those data we have an analysis, and then we produce an internal report, a clinical study report, which can run to thousands of pages. Then there are various things that might go to conferences. From that study report, we don't then extract the data automatically. No, again, a different human being usually sits down and starts to write a 2,000-word paper. So we start again with what we think of as the primary report, but it's not really the primary report. It's several stages on, and all the same information, if you think about it, that was originally written in the protocol that actually derives from the data has appeared in this paper, and yet we've just been busy repackaging it. And surely, with information technology, we could find better ways of doing that and actually go back to the source, which would not only be more efficient, but probably more accurate as well, because I'm sure that actually errors occur, sometimes intentional, but sometimes unintentional, between when we keep reinventing this and repackaging the data and producing it for different audiences. So it's a very inefficient process. And as Doug mentioned, then the primary paper then becomes the raw material for further secondary publications as well. And yet we're then even further away from the primary data.
Liz, you asked me to
Yes.
tell you. We will now
Yes.
read your question.
Okay, thank you. Apologies. We don't use automation enough. We could use templates a great deal more, and I think there are opportunities for that we need to explore. The publishers have maybe made some attempts, but I think they are timid. This is Elsevier's so-called Article of the Future, which I have to say looks remarkably similar to the one that appeared 300 years ago. So, going back, and I do only have just 4 more slides, so I hope I will allow some time for questioning, but thank you, Amanda, for keeping me to time. What do journals do? This is, the good stuff that we agreed that they've been doing for the last 300 years. Let's not forget, though, that they may have some adverse consequences as well. There is some bad stuff. So, as well as disseminating, they may be actually restricting access. They may be enforcing copyright and, for example, preventing translation. Peer review may be favouring controversial findings, new or positive findings, and perhaps is introducing bias. I'm not saying that these are very common, but I think we do need to consider them. It may be causing delay. There is archiving, but we know that the journals are not terribly keen on actually curating the raw data themselves. And we know also that retractions and corrections are not always linked back to the original papers. So there is some bad stuff as well. Do we still need journals? Think about the good things they do and think about what other technology we could use. So perhaps we don't need debate, we can use Twitter, we can use the social media. Perhaps we don't need them for distribution, we can just have repositories, and they can also act to register the research and so on, or register the findings. Perhaps we can use the cloud for storage and simply use the search engines for retrieval. As I say, we're already not just looking via the journal, we're looking for individual articles. And I completely agree with Doug that we could think about automatic templates early on in the process rather than sort of applying the quality later on. If you remember the things that I said the journals did, I think the things they are still good at is correction and version control. That is something that repositories are really rather bad at. And back to the entertainment function that I mentioned as perhaps peripheral, but let's not forget the survey that did find the most widely read pages in the BMJ were the obituaries, not the clinical trials. And I'd just like to end with some words of wisdom from a former editor of the BMJ, Richard Smith. And he said, "It took me many years to realise that I completely misunderstood what journals did. I imagined that doctors opened their BMJs on Friday mornings, read of some innovation and used it on the next relevant patient. Many still seem to cling to this naive view of the function of journals. In fact, words on paper rarely lead directly to change, and thank goodness they don't, considering the rubbish that journals often publish. What journals do best is what the rest of the media do best: stir up, prompt, debate, upset, probe, legitimise and set agendas. They're good at telling readers what to think about, but not what to think, and theme issues may be particularly successful in putting important but neglected subjects to doctors. Increasingly, I wonder as well if there isn't something fundamentally misguided in sending ordinary clinicians who are not scientists piles of original papers that they mostly don't read, often aren't relevant to them, and they're not trained to appraise. If we were clearer about the purpose of journals, we might redesign them completely." And he wrote that in 2004. I would agree. I think actually the function of presenting raw data is perhaps not well served by journals. They are good at commentary, they are good at focus, they are good at selecting what might be relevant to their readers. But perhaps we need to move on and think about different methods of presenting data. Thank you.